Hey everyone, I'm Sam Alkin, Associate Professor here in the Department of Food Science. Welcome to our food safety office hours. Here in Ithaca, someone switched our warm sunny days to cold rainy ones, and while that might not be the type of fraud we're talking about, it definitely warrants an investigation because it impacts what I eat. Now, identifying real food fraud isn't easy. Sometimes it's, implications are only economic. You don't get what you pay for, and that can be hard to see. But other times it has some food safety implications. So that poster child being, way back in the day, the melamine and infant formula in China a few years ago. And it can really be a proverbial cat and mouse game trying to identify fraudsters, their methods. And today's guests are going to give us a window into how agencies are tackling the ever evolving food fraud challenge. So joining us are Dan McCarthy. He's the director of the Division of Food Safety and Inspection for New York State Department of Ag and Markets. The division's inspectors are responsible for regulating and inspecting over 36,000 food establishments throughout New York State. We've also got Dr. John Spink joining us. He is the director of the Food Fraud Initiative and an assistant professor in the Department of Supply Chain Management in the Eli Broad Business College at Michigan State University. And he's got a long history dealing with food safety and fraud issues in the US and across the world. We also have Dr. Aliosa Trimchek, who's our senior extension associate here in the Department of Food Science, and myself. So as you're listening to Dan's talk this morning, if you've got questions, feel free. There's a little button at the bottom for a chat box. You click that chat box. You can type your question in there. You can send it to everyone, or you can send it to me, and I will read it out. And I know that a number of you have already pre-submitted some questions, and we will get to that on the panel after Dan's talk. So thank you for joining us. Think of those questions, and I will hand it over, Dan, to kind of just talk about what's going on here in New York State. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much. Okay. Is it sharing okay?
Looking great.
All right, thank you. So thanks for inviting me to talk about this important topic. We'll jump right in. So just a little basics. So the Department of Agriculture and Markets Division of Food Safety, our primary focus is public health. But having said that, so much of this topic blends into public health that, it is worth our effort to investigate and, and look at these issues. Some of the things that we look at, that crosses over into public health are things like undeclared preservatives, sulfites and the like. We have some things that could be misbranded products, right? If you think about it, if you're buying a certain product, you might have an allergic reaction to, a component of that, but if it's not labeled because, the product that you think you're buying is something other than that, that becomes a public health issue. So having said that, let's talk a little bit about, a couple of things we work on. So we look for undeclared sulfites. Our inspectors are very well trained to look at products they see on store shelves, possibly in manufacturing, where something doesn't quite look right, and they might, test it for things like sulfites, right? Sulfites is a preservative, and, some things, when they are shelf stable, they look better when they have a preservative in there, especially if it's undeclared. And when you hit a certain threshold of sulfites that are undeclared, it can actually become a serious health concern for if you have a sensitivity. Having said that, we have set threshold levels for recalls for undeclared sulfites. When it's below 3.7 milligrams per serving, the likelihood of an adverse health consequence is actually relatively low. It could happen, right? But it becomes an economic issue at that point. It is still undeclared. It is still something that is not on the label. If you do not want this in your food, you want it to be on the label so you know, right? So we have different classes of recalls. Class 1 are those recalls where a product is very likely to cause an adverse health impact. You can imagine those things are very, very serious. Class 2 is a less likelihood of an adverse health effect. And then class 3 is basically unlikely, but it is still potentially a health consequence, right? So we would still follow up and we'd still want that product removed from commerce. we test some things, it's a consideration of cross contact, but it's also consideration of economic, fraud. We do actually test meat for species, right? If our inspector sees a meat processing plant and they see a likelihood for cross contamination, they might test the ground beef to see if it contains something other than beef. We're looking for the cross contamination, but it could also be, perhaps, an economic issue, right? We happen to have tested, ground beef 71 times for another species, and 53 of those 71 actually contain some level of pork, right? 10 of the 71 contain some level of poultry, right? Was that a cross contamination or was it intentional? We do not try to determine an intent here, but we do find, this, and if we hit a threshold of around 3% of the contents being something other than what the label is, we will ask for that product to be recalled. The label is essentially incorrect on what was being sold. We also look at ground beef for fat. So if you can imagine, you're buying, 90% lean ground beef, right? If we have reason to believe there's an error, we might test it for the fat content. We might determine that, the 90% is entirely accurate. But if it's more than 2% off, we might ask for that product to come off the shelf. It is essentially not as labeled. I learned recently that the USDA has a threshold level for ground beef. It's not intended to be sold, at more than 30% fat, right? So we may check also that the fat product, if it's labeled at 30%, then it's not more than that. Again, you can consider that potentially an economic issue. You're not getting what you're paying for. We test other things for authenticity also, right? We have reason to believe that we should test a significant amount of honey, right? It's our understanding that honey, produced in, several places in the country and out of the country may not be pure honey, right? It might be adulterated with corn syrup or other sweeteners, right? So we have tested 189 and 10 of those were not found to be pure honey. Our lab was able to determine, other, sugar or sweetening agents were added to it. I think a lot of people know that olive oil sometimes isn't, authentically 100% olive oil, right? So we've tested 237 of those over the last couple of years. 33 of them were found to be less than 100% olive oil. I'm not saying that they were all another kind of oil, but, they were at least blended. And 25 of those were imported, right? So sometimes, you're looking for, I'm going to get my olive oil from a certain part of the country because it's authentic. Well, maybe it is, and maybe it is not. And what we've noticed recently, uptick I've seen in the grocery stores, pomegranate juice is becoming, pretty popular. I see it in the juice aisles all the time, right? I guess it's a relatively expensive one. And 19 times we decided to test it for purity, and 4 of those times it was not pure pomegranate juice, right? So one of the things that our inspectors look at is they look at the price point. If the price point is really, not as what you expected, relatively low, perhaps that's a risk that what's on the label isn't really so. It's just a risk, right? None of these things we found were completely, epidemic about, being mischaracterized on what's on the label, but it's something to think about. We also test for undeclared colors. Now, undeclared colors is a health concern. There are people out there with sensitivities to certain colors, even if they're approved colors by the FDA, right? When they're undeclared, that is a health concern, and it may potentially be an economic concern too. If you're buying a food product and the color looks especially vibrant, right? And if you are concerned about that, you're going to look at the label. Is this the true color of this product, or is there something in here that I'm concerned about? If it's not labeled, our inspectors are trained to use their eyes and look at, perhaps candies or things that are very colorful. They will look at the label. If they don't see a declared color, they might choose to send it to the lab and said, I think we should test for undeclared colored here. And we are finding that from time to time. Right? That's not to say that the color is unallowed, but it does need to be declared. Right? And I want to throw this out there too, because it is actually an economic issue. It is not something obviously we can send to the lab, but there are products out there that are labeled in kosher or halal. When they're labeled such, I believe there's a higher economic value to those products, right? Now, while we can't check for that, obviously, we do have a process to register those firms that are marking their food as kosher or halal. And if nothing else, we can share with the consumer, the information that is gained from those producers and allow the consumers to make an informed decision if they agree or what they describe as kosher halal meets their dietary needs. It's important for people to get what they pay for, and special foods like kosher and halal are important attributes that some people look for, and they're willing to pay up for it. We don't want to see food products that are labeled kosher halal but do not go through the process to actually make them so. So that's another thing that we watch for, and we welcome people to observe this and ask questions. They can ask questions of the establishment, or they can go to our website where many of these firms, but not everybody, is registered. We are trying to improve that registration process. I know that was a quick and dirty, conversation. I want to give you a feel for, although we're a public health agency and our food lab has lots of capacity to test things, right? We also are aware of economic fraud issues, and we're willing to engage and take a look at them. So thank you for your attention, and ready to answer questions as you might have them.
Great, thanks, Dan. And we'll open it up for John and Al to join the panel. And again, if you have questions, feel free to just type them in the chat box and I'll ask them. But overall, we'll start with like then some overall bigger questions. So, you talked a little bit, Dan, about meats and olive oil. Are those the most common foods associated with fraud, or are there particular foods that we see, that are the biggest issues? And John, too, you let us know what you see from all over.
Well, I was recently a participant in a meeting, and there was a firm that specializes in investigating food fraud and providing some supply chains controls, and it was a very interesting presentation. I took some great notes. He attributed certain products from certain countries as a high incidence of fraud. I don't remember seeing specific data. I certainly don't have specific data, right? And I think it could potentially be a hit or miss. You could have, certain food products from certain regions, but the individual suppliers could have different ethical, considerations and different economic considerations. I don't know that I can point to any one thing that says this is higher risk, this is lower risk, right? It might behoove people buying raw material supplies for their products to investigate, what is the nature of the industry? What's the nature of the industry in the places you're purchasing from? And what are the risks? There may be opportunities to test your raw materials that come in if you identify what those risks are.
I may add on to that. It's really difficult to say what is the biggest food fraud incident. We can look at what we've seized, but the key is we don't know what we didn't seize. So it's a good starting point. And a lot of times we're looking at two different ways. One is, well, first off, food fraud prevention is what I do. I've been doing it for 20 years here, and helped GFSI write the first definitions of the term and those kind of things. So love to talk to anybody that's got any questions about the topic. Please connect with me. I need to hear from you. So we can see in the past, there's been, the well-known ones were horse meat and beef across Europe. That happens here. Olive oil, extra virgin, is it Italian? Is it not? Credence attributes like halal, kosher, organic. can be ones that are easy to swap a label. You talked about honey. Definitely different types of honey, different types of processes to keep the bees alive over the winter and things like that. So there's a lot out there. So from the government side, it's really a challenge because where's food fraud? And it's usually where you're not looking, because the fraudsters are smart. They're aware of our systems most likely. So when we're looking at one thing, or let's say that we decide to work with Cornell, and the state of New York starts to work at honey, everybody knows you're looking at honey. If you're a good fraudster, then you switch to olive oil for this season. And if next year's olive oil, they'll switch back. So that's tough. And I think the big thing is that we've seen is the broad types of testing and monitoring, especially public health threats. And like Dan said, is that ultimately the food agencies are public health agencies first. That's where the priority is, and then more broad. But we look for where people get sick. Now, from a company standpoint, it's different. One thing for them is they start with their vulnerabilities to look at how they operate, and where there are parts of their either who they buy from, how they receive product, how they test product, to see where they might be vulnerable. And just like you as a person, if you're ill, you don't just start taking cancer medicine. You'll go to your doctor and figure out, are you just dehydrated, or did you eat something? Did you have something else going on? And that's the same thing with food fraud from a company standpoint, is to look at it from the broad sense. And so it's a challenge between the way that agencies have to look at the world and the way that companies protect themselves.
Interesting. Yeah. What are some of the specific steps then that they should be taking to protect themselves as companies, right, for their supply chains?
And I'll say the big thing first is it's hard to think about this because most of us are food safety people. We're thinking about microbes and chemicals and testing and going to the lab, and that's what we know. My first academic appointment was in the School of Criminal Justice. That's different. So I'd have to say to everybody, repeat after me: social science, say it. Social science, say it.
Social science, yeah,
is a real science.
It's a real science.
See, and so you can't get the physical scientist to not laugh with that. But it's studying the bad guys. It's not E. coli. It's a human adversary, and that's where it gets really different. They're intelligent. They're creative. They're often well funded. And that's not what we're used to dealing with. So, but the criminologists have no problem with that. The first thing that criminologists do is say, let's look at the situation. What incidents do we have? What's the worst ones? So, like from Dan's perspective, it's what makes people in the state of New York sick. That's just the way to start. And then we look at economic impact. We know which New York products are most impacted. In Michigan, we have Michigan tart cherries. That's something we watch closely. And so that's where you start. And then we look at then the key with criminology and crime prevention is to look at your system weaknesses. Think about your house. If you left your front door unlocked, you're more vulnerable to being robbed than you had it locked. Now, in your neighborhood, maybe no one else locks their doors either, but still, you're more vulnerable. Now, if you live in a neighborhood where there are a lot of break-ins, or your Ring doorbell has been going crazy for the last couple nights of people shaking your door to try to get in, then you would lock your door. Now, if you right now wonder if you left your door unlocked, you'd call home and have someone go lock your door. The key there is vulnerabilities versus risks. And we, as a material scientists, we're used to looking at statistical probability. Give us the data. Let us know what's the 95% confidence interval. That's tough when it's crime and it's more random. It's hard to do probabilistic risk assessment on events that have never occurred or may never occur. And that's a big challenge with food defense as well. And that's where the idea of vulnerabilities. How do we buy? Like, let's say the halal product was a good question. What's great there is traceability and audit. So you buy from a supplier and then go to them and see if they actually have a certificate to produce halal. What products do they produce? And then to even go visit them, can they make 1,000 pounds or 10,000 pounds? If they can only make 1,000 pounds and you're buying 5,000 pounds, then by mass balance, something different than just going to a lab to test, you know that they inherently can't meet that need. We're looking for vulnerabilities. Now, at that point, then, when you receive product, you may do certain tests. So let's say it is a super high priced beef. Maybe every third load you do a species test on it. But the thing is then then that's just catching fraud. You don't want to just catch it. We want to prevent it. So you do the test on every fifth load. Let's say there was a perfect DNA test for the most wonderful Cornell DNA'd beef. Angus beef, Cornell Angus beef. There's a perfect DNA test. We do that test every once in a while, but we don't just test for it. Because again, all we'll do is catch the bad guys. We want to let our entire supply chain know we're going to be doing that perfect test. Because then let's say that Donna is working in this network, but she's got her own fake. She has those Dartmouth cows that she's trying to sell into the Cornell people. And she knows she can, because she's got a couple Cornell cows, so she could sell us and hey, we've seen them. But if she knows that that there's this perfect test that we may be doing, she now realizes in the midst of her entire operation, she could get caught and her entire operation could go down. She's not a 100% professional criminal. That's not all she does. She just kind of switch it around. But all of a sudden, if she knows that, if we communicate that we've got these tests, then we reduce the vulnerability. And that's the case. If we are just taking the paperwork from Donna, knowing that there's people out there that have both Dartmouth and Cornell cows, then there's an inherent vulnerability. It's almost like forensic accounting more than anything. And that's the key first. It's really hard, though, because that's not what we're used to from our normal set of experiences.
Right. Interesting. So, yeah. So then chasing those vulnerabilities, or identifying those vulnerabilities, and then I guess trying to announce, right, the systems that you have in place to catch them. You talked a little bit about, how some people might switch, like, all right, they do honey this year, or they might do something the next year. Is that what we're seeing in food fraud? Is it usually like an opportunist that is looking for different ways to cheat the system versus a repeat offender on a specific category? Yeah.
Well, and so this is the real challenge with social science versus a material science. You can't measure 100% of everything. And even if you did measure everything, you don't know what their intent was. And a couple of you made that key point, is that food fraud could be intentional or unintentional. If someone's scale is off and they don't know it, let's say that Donna has a sloppy operations manager, and they do happen to send a few of the Dartmouth cows over with the Cornell cows. Now, that's not intentional on her part. Now, she is gaining from a fraudulent act, but it's unintentional. It's from being sloppy. There's an inherent nature of that. So that's part of it. But we don't know what a lot of times we can't judge what the root cause is. If she's good, she's going to have that, oh, golly, the paperwork was off. So that's a tough one at the start. But then things we want to look at where there are these inherent vulnerabilities or system weaknesses or process weaknesses, and then go to try to change them. And my point was, with criminology, we don't know exactly, we can't know what Donna's actually thinking. Right. So we can't say statistically to a high level of what those fraudsters are, but we look broadly at them, and there's like 13 types of criminals, but we took the arsonists out of the list and things like that. So basically it boils down to about 5. Recreational are people that do things for fun or kicks. Not that so much here, but maybe, it might be fun. Occasional. So let's say that Donna has a manager that just occasionally is sloppy, and a few of those Dartmouth cows went through and she made 1,000 more per cow. She's not necessarily going to call you and say, it's like, oh, okay, she didn't try to commit crime, but it happened. She realized it later, and no one complained. That's occasional. Professional are the people that all they do all the time is this. And there is organized crime involved, maybe owning businesses, but it seems to be very low because they're not one-off. If they're committing fraud, if she's got a good gig going this, she's going to keep doing it. Right. And that's where we see most of the people probably are in the occupational criminal, in their day-to-day operations, in her operations, having a legitimate cow, beef raising process, butchering and everything, then she sees this little opportunity here and there. That's where we see it. The key with that is that this network of people, where most of them are probably occupational, we can communicate to them covertly to say, hey, everybody, look, we're all on the call. We're worried about food fraud and that Cornell beef. What do you all think about it? And so we don't know who could be a criminal, but the thing is, we're communicating to them and we're telling them, hey, watch out. We're going to put plans in place. You might get caught. And that's the key. Is the goal is not to catch food fraud. The goal is to prevent it from occurring in the first place. So as an industry or as companies, you can do that. It's harder from the government side, but it's really a public-private partnership gets more to that, where the government has a role of, if Dan starts to know that is this Cornell versus Dartmouth beef, as soon as it gets along, then all of a sudden, the New York Department of Agriculture starts to test for that specific test. Now, that's not saying he's testing for everything now. That makes Dan's job more efficient, because the main concern for public health, and in this case for economic, and for the state to support your agriculture and rural development, is he knows now that prioritizing the test for the Cornell beef, specifically in relation to the Dartmouth beef or non-Cornell beef, gets to be the focus. And then we can talk about it already. Now, look, we already have this deeper explanation of the problem of the bad guy and how things might occur. So let's say then we ask Sam and Cindy if they would vote for Dan, support the funding of Dan to have more funding for those type of specific tests. All of a sudden, we kind of get it. And so that's where we start to take the criminology, social science aspect, and we can look at disrupting the network. We're not just catching food fraud, we're trying to prevent it.
Interesting. So that reporting, so the initial thing, how does someone report, or I guess raise the alarm that there's, this is happening, or it may be there's a vulnerability in the system and it looks like it's happening? Is there like a formal reporting system at the state or at the national level, or?
Well, as far as we're concerned, we have an open portal for anyone to complain about anything, right? So if you go to our website for the agriculture.ny.gov, right, you can get to, sending in a complaint. Somebody can send in, and people do. I have seen complaints where someone alleged, I bought, 80% ground beef, but darn it, there's no way that's true, right? We have followed up. We have looked at that product. We have interviewed, the retailer, and we've, tried to grab a sample and take it to the lab, right? If we have a problem, we will respond back to the retailer. You have a problem here. This product is mislabeled, is misbranded, right? And we'll respond back to consumer that, their complaint was followed up and this is what we found, right? Hypothetically, if we get a call from a manufacturer and said, I got this raw material and it's this, right? We will look at it first as, a health issue, but we will look at it as an economic issue. I can't promise you we're going to be in the business of testing manufacturers' raw material supply, right? Our food lab does tens of thousands of tests that we are obligated to do on a year-to-year basis, right? Under our public health mandate, right? So we would take that information, we would carefully consider our resources, and we'll consider if this is worth testing or not, right? I think you would do better contracting with private lab, because you want the results faster and you want to be able to deal with them yourself, right? I'm not going to say we wouldn't respond. I'm not trying to suggest that, right? But this is a public health resource, and we have to use that as effectively as possible.
Right. Cindy and I would need to advocate for more funds from New York State for you to have a more robust system for that. Yeah.
From my perspective, it's really looking at what's the impact, public health and economic, and about how we have a response. And that's tough. And part of that is looking at the role of an agency and what can you figure, and what's the role of prevention versus detection. And then the priority of public health is a real key. And with food fraud, the key is food fraud is the cause. The effect could be an economic impact,
right? But
the effect could also be a public health impact, where let's say that Donna's manager doesn't handle the Dartmouth. So the Dartmouth and Cornell beef are great, but there's all of a sudden just some backwoods beef, and all of a sudden that's not had the veterinary records, and it's unhealthy or it's spoiled. Yep. And all of a sudden then, so the root cause of that, the vulnerability is food fraud, but the impact, the effect is food safety. And that's been a real challenge at the very beginning, even working with AFDO and others, is that the way that we identified situations were the effect. So all of a sudden food fraud occurs, it falls in the food safety bucket, it triggers the food safety responses, as it should. But all of a sudden then we move so fast on food safety incidents that all the evidence is destroyed and the criminals destroy their paperwork and run away. But we have to do that because you have to prioritize public health. That's a problem with counterfeit medicines as well. That was where I first worked at counterfeit medicines, is that you've got a public health threat out there and you have to respond to that first. And that could lead the criminal network to disband or destroy records. But we have to do it. So that's a real challenge when we're looking at even, trying to figure out the root cause. Again, the role of an agency is tough in there. It's really public-private partnership, because it's got to know what we all have a specific role to play. And it's not doing everything. And that's a real tough part. But if we talk together, like say, it would be like in some states, like we do in Michigan, or Cornell would then lead talking to the state about the Cornell beef. And then why not talk to Dartmouth about the Dartmouth beef? And then you have this idea of what's the network, what's the vulnerability. Then Cornell says, what's our role? And then the state says, what's our role? And then the producers like Donna say, what's our role as well? And now we have agreement. Now we can be efficient. and we can share the non-confidential information. That's another key, but for another day, is that we can share. Now all of a sudden the network is strong, as well as realizing, remember, that they're probably occupational fraudsters. The person in Donna or in her organization, they're going to identify these. They're not looking to commit fraud, but they all of a sudden see this huge opportunity. Cornell beef for $1,000 more than Dartmouth beef. I mean, remember, these are criminals, sociopaths, and not smart about public health and things. And that, when we realize that's what we're dealing with, it's someone in an organization. It's a different deal.
Right. So that's it. And interesting. So they're not smart, generally not smart about public health, because in some ways, right, the incentive would be, if you're going to do fraud, do it in a way that doesn't ring any other alarm bells. But then, right, they don't know what they're doing or what the implications are. And then that's when we cascade into some sort of food safety issue.
And we'd say that good food fraudsters would have no public health threat. And man, when you have that Cornell beef, it is not only Cornell beef, it's the best Cornell beef you've ever had. And because they're making $1,000 a unit, they're going to make sure that you're so happy, and there's going to be no public health threat. Think about counterfeit alcohol. Think if you got counterfeit alcohol into the name the national chain into 7-Eleven for Grey Goose vodka, counterfeit vodka. If you got that in there, you would work so hard to make people love the 7-Eleven Grey Goose vodka, and people and because you're making millions and millions and millions. Now that's was that the best case from a public health standpoint, that the fraudsters are really knowledgeable. But again, for the basics, when we start, it's important to separate morals and ethics from the equation, because it's kind of unhelpful, because again, they're criminals, not afraid to break the law. They're wired that way. Sociopaths, not concerned with cheating people, thinks it's kind of funny. And then also, when I say not smart, they don't understand peanut allergen can be a problem. They don't understand cross-contamination or things like that. And I sometimes say ignorant, but if you say the word ignorant, there's kind of an insinuation that's intentional, that you're ignorant of it, but they just don't know these impacts a lot of times. So that's the worst case. And if we start with that, then we look at our systems and say, how do we buy the Grey Goose vodka? Do we ever check with the manufacturer? And sometimes you only have to do that once or twice a year. Or like let's say you're buying directly from someone you trust, but you're still going to do the Cornell beef DNA test, I don't know, 3 times a year just to check. That just keeps the system going. And it might not cost very much. But then you look at honey, look at olive oil, and you can look at what other things do we accept the label where we pay a premium based on something. Then what can we do? Some simple test, and we communicate it so the bad guys know.
Right, exactly. Now,
and apologies, Donna, for using you as the case.
Yeah, Donna.
I do want to weigh in really quickly, John. In my role, I primarily work with fresh produce, so raw agricultural commodities. And a lot of the examples that have been given so far were further processed. Spices we talk about, juices, honey. But I did want to mention, in terms of mislabeling, something that we see is really that economic motivation. So mislabeling of organic certifications. I wanted to throw that example in there, because until I started kind of reading in prep for this panel, I hadn't considered it very much. But I don't know if Dan has much experience in organic certificate and also geographic, made in or grown in the USA, mislabeling. But I know on the USDA webpage, it's enough of an issue that there is a reporting website. But in terms of, there's this database. So in case this interests anybody, there is a database through the National Organic Program to look up organic certifications. And I also found it interesting that they actually have a Excel sheet of fraudulent certificates. So not only looking up actual organic certified operations, but also what do those fraudulent certificates look like? And that's probably one of the more common ones I've seen. But again, I wanted to follow up in terms of economic motivations. There is that premium on organic produce, as well as certain geographic regions, but also follow the paperwork in that database. And no harm done with my Cornell beef.
Yeah, I don't have any firsthand information about fraudulent organic. In our work as a government regulator, a lot of paper comes over our desk, and a lot of paper, leaves our desk and goes to other, I have seen one unusual incident where, we are certifying to a foreign government that, the food that was delivered, imported into that country was from a factory or manufacturer that was duly inspected by us. And one country reached out to us and said they provided this document. Is it accurate? Well, the image I saw really didn't look that good. And I was able to determine it was a document issued by us and altered, right? Now, clearly we have no idea who did the alteration, because it goes through many, many hands, right? But we reached back to the government and said, this is not an accurate document. The products described and the company described are not, and under our purview, and we have nothing to say about that product. There are a whole host of any attribute of any product, food or otherwise, that would, increase the value, right? And every one of those, if you can skip that step and still increase the value without the incurring cost, those are the opportunities I believe, John and Donna were talking about, right? If you're aware of those steps, then that's the first thing. How do I control to make sure that step it feels important to me, is in there, right? I love John to be talking about the halal part, right? Those are great ideas, interview the supplier. I'm going to ask for 5,000 pounds. Talk to me. And he said, well, I've got 3 cows. Well, do the math. All right. But you know what? I think it starts with the inquiry. You're informing your suppliers that you're aware of risk and you are informed of them and you care. And I think that increases the risk of the person that might be making these, call them mistakes, right? I'm not going to get involved in intent. I'm not, right? But even an honest company, that has a sloppy paperwork, they're going to say, I don't want my reputation pulled through here because someone's going to catch me, right? I much rather, put in an additional control so that when they test this product, right, my buyer is going to be happy because they're getting what I think I'm selling to them, right? Make the cost of doing fraud higher by sharing that and communicating that you're going to test. I'm not suggesting it's going to be the dummy camera at the top of your building. That's not really a camera, right? That's not always the best thing. I think it's useful to actually do it. That's just Dan talking.
Well, and the thing is that from an agency standpoint, Dan, the group doing some things, then the fraudster starts to worry that they might be the next one to get caught. Because one thing you do not want is a government agency or the FDA or customs to have you on a list. And so remember, these are mostly occupational criminals where they've got another full business. This just pads their wallets a bit. So that can scare everyone together. Now, organics, I'm actually very familiar. We were funded through USDA and the Organic Trade Association to create 2 training programs for USDA inspectors. So in the Organic Integrity Learning Center has free training videos. So there's 2 of ours on organic fraud and the criminal mind. It's all organic products, not just food, because you've got clothing, you've got fibers and things. And so the key is that's USDA's training for USDA inspectors. So if you are getting inspected, then you can, the thing with USDA is not trying to catch anybody doing it wrong. They're trying to help everybody do it right. So that's a key in there. And a big part of that is documentation. And with organic, if it's a credence attribute, meaning something you can't really taste or measure a lot of times, then, okay, organics, you can, pesticides, but let's say in general, the statement is it gets really tough and it gets a lot about the documents. And we actually I've worked with a fraud document examiner, certified fraud document examiner, who's a professor of intelligence analysis at the Citadel in South Carolina, Roy Fenoff. And we're finishing a paper and a whole direction of research on food document fraud and food document fraud prevention, because they're certified document examiners. That's what he's done for 25 years in his life. And there's people that they're fraud, transport, tax, tariff, a free trade zone document fraud examiners. As a product comes in a free trade zone, maybe it changes its origin because you're charging a higher tariff from Thailand or China. So there's people that are experts in the area. So we're bringing that together in the food fraud standpoint, because, well, as Dan said, the documents, they start with a basic document, make some sloppy photocopies, switch something in, make a couple more photocopies. It looks fairly real, but the type of fraud it's the same type of fraud because they're trying to do the same things, either the date, either an old lot number, either a certification. Or, the basic types of fraud are similar. Now, once we identify those, let's say a certificate of analysis that says it's a certain level of protein content. Now that we know that's the type of fraud that occurs in the document, now we can go back and tie that to one specific type of test for protein, not for fat. We're looking for protein or a certain type of protein. That's the key, is then we can break this down into some really common areas. The bad guys are great at confusing everything and mixing things up. And then we get so busy, we're not sure exactly how we do it until we deconstruct it as from the crime science standpoint. I tell you, I love my job if you haven't figured it out. I mean, it's like international intrigue, it's crime, it's all sorts of crazy stuff. Don't get me started up that when people put illegal drugs in food, like that's a big one in bananas or pineapples to get cocaine into the country because it throws off the dogs. So there'll be these pineapples where they core out the inside and put cocaine in it in bags.
Yeah, that's wild, right? But then those pineapples are meant to be, right, I guess, caught by somebody who's gonna pull out the drugs, right?
It's Alex ascended to
but I'm not gonna go to Wegmans and pop the top
no.
my pineapple and suddenly yeah.
So, think about this. Well, this is the thing to start thinking about the vulnerabilities and like what are the criminal networks. When you think about it from their perspective, it makes total sense. So let's say that I see John on there and Cindy. So John and Cindy are going to try, they have this opportunity to get a lot of cocaine into the country. Now they're going to think, how are we going to do that? Now, let's say that John is a pineapple exporter and Cindy's a pineapple importer. Now, when we look at it's called routine activities theory. The crimes that you find are the ones that are in your routine activities. Then there's rational choice theory, that the criminals think they're making a rational choice that they're not going to get caught. So now let's be really rocket scientists here. So let's put your social science hat on. Cindy as an importer of pineapples, John as an exporter of pineapples. Where's their fraud opportunity? In pineapples. So for them, if they're importing 100 containers every year, they're going to know about the ports. When do the ports have their training classes? Is it during a Champions League soccer game when everyone's in the building not doing inspections? They're going to know they're going to have their drivers look at how product moves through the port and when they can slip something through. So they only need to slip through 1 or 2 cases of product in the shipping container. And if they know, again, if it's a big soccer game and there's light inspection, then they'll time that container to go through. And so again, that's not going to show up at Wegmans usually. Sometimes something does slip out and someone opens. There was one where ecstasy was put by a syringe into wine bottles. And then later they deconstruct, and a couple of them got into the market. And so, but most likely it's in between those networks. But all of a sudden it makes sense. The challenge then gets to be back with like the government agencies, customs trying to find that. I mean, these are 2 people that are in legitimate business, 100 shipping containers a year. And then it's not like Cindy's making cocaine at home and selling it on the streets herself. And it's really hard to find those people. So that's back to it's us looking at what are our specific roles. And I think like a Cornell, like we do here, is to be a point to start to ask the questions of products in your region, and then bring together people to look at those vulnerabilities and bring in the other disciplines to basically do a food fraud vulnerability assessment for the country, or for the state. And then to see where's the vulnerabilities, where's the biggest impact on public health, and also economic is a big one. So those for like you within your state would be where the biggest products that contribute to your GDP.
Right. Yeah.
With Interpol, we do a lot with Interpol, which again, love my job. You travel around mostly Europe for that. But we've helped countries do vulnerability assessments, food fraud vulnerability assessments for their country. And then someone like the Danish food crime unit, they will do a vulnerability assessment for their country and identify what are the trends. Like for them around Christmas time, there's special types of cakes that are on sale that are really expensive, and they see a massive then coming in. They also have big for them are like a Christmas pig or piglet. Okay. And so all of a sudden then is it fresh? Is it frozen? Is it old? Is it if different species? They know by the time of year the type of fraud, and they know that those things are coming in a couple months before. So they shift their focus based on their vulnerabilities. There's actually a great Nordic food fraud vulnerability assessment report that the Nordic countries got together to look at food fraud for the entire region, and that's I think a great benchmark or template for a state.
Right. Yeah, and I've seen that. I was in Italy last year, and I was with an organization there that was looking at, how to determine, that a cheese was from a particular region, and developing the testing to kind of try to validate that and keep those denominator or those origins set. So it can be a
Europe's
lot of
different.
money, right? Yeah.
Europe is different than the U.S. because Europe, a country is not, Parma cheese is never going to outproduce Wisconsin Parmesan cheese. And the U.S. Parmesan is a processing method. There, it's a region. So there, they have to spend a lot more time and money because of the economic impact. They need to make sure that, Parma cheese and Champagne and those other products are as valuable and contributing to the economy as possible. So they spend a lot of time and money. And that's why you'll see like the EU, there's a Joint Research Center, JRC has a monthly food fraud report of products, European products. And they spend that because they are looking at the premium products, because again, they're never going to outproduce the US with exception, a few exceptions of some specific products.
Right. Yeah. Talking about I guess tracking, right? There's a lot of things here around traceability, right? And understanding where your food comes from. FSMA, right, explicitly says, right, we're not focused on food fraud, right, and things like that, unless it has a public health, impact. But what about auditing schemes like BRC, SQF? Are those helping some companies manage this, or some of the new traceability rules, or is this really an opportunistic thing? So it's somebody within the company, and they're dotting their I's and crossing their T's, so it's hard to catch anyways.
No, well, early on, I was very involved with GFSI at the beginning, and there was a food fraud think tank because they were saying, what is melamine? What's food fraud around that time? And in the midst of that project, horse meat occurred. So the question to our task force changed from what is food fraud to how will GFSI adopt food fraud prevention attributes? Because GFSI is a quality management system like HACCP really is. Identify root causes and prevent them. We think of it all as public health and thing, but it's really a quality management. GFSI looks at the root cause of food safety incidents. Food fraud and food defense separately are root causes. So being a quality management system, it would consider everything. Now, it's not saying that food fraud or food defense is going to be super high compared to E. coli, but it still is a root cause. So the food safety management systems require that companies do vulnerability assessments for food fraud and have prevention strategies. But then the intensity of that is based on the overall risk. And it's the Global Food Safety Initiative, the Food Safety Modernization Act. It's judged first on the food safety impact. Now, if you talk to the board of directors of a company, they're going to be really worried about the economic impact as well. So right. GFSI has got the food safety systems, and GFSI is the foundation, the benchmark for BRC, FSSC 20000, SQF, IFS, and others. So it's absolutely 100% required that companies to meet the food safety certification to have it in there. The USDA organic, with the strengthening organic enforcement guides, is required to do those vulnerability assessments and prevention strategies. Now, again, how big are they compared to HACCP? Small, but it's also based on your risk, the risk of public health and the risk of economic on a business. Now, what we haven't seen is really full adoption of it, or really robust. And we have a food fraud annual update that we're getting a lot of encouragement to do again this year, because when companies, what we found 2 years ago was companies grossly overestimated, had gross overconfidence in the robustness of their systems. So the companies thought that they were fully meeting their guidelines, and they looked closely and they weren't. But more importantly, is you worried about your suppliers, that your suppliers are telling you that they completely meet the GFSI certifications. Right. And we found that a lot of them aren't. Now, the thing is, there's a lot going on over the last 4 years. So yeah, but this is a requirement of the food safety certification. And if you're not meeting it, then you miss your requirement. And so that's what we see now is we need a calibration point. So again, Sam, would love to partner with you. Cornell's halfway to my sister on the coast of Maine. So it's pretty easy to get me to stop by. It's a perfect halfway point. Yeah. Actually, someone mentioned Albany versus Ithaca, and Albany is usually where we stay. But that's something to look at is this idea of what's the expectation, what are people doing, and the first steps really aren't that complex. It's just you have to be full. Think about your health. If you're worried about skin cancer, then you need to have somebody, your spouse, your neighbor, whoever, look over you once a month. That's not expensive. It just is something you have to do. But you're worried about skin cancer, not about a broken leg. And that's a key is getting for it. So it is absolutely 100% required. So an agency or the USDA could ask companies for their food fraud prevention vulnerability assessments. Because if they say they're compliant with GFSI, GFSI food safety system, it would be in place. Actually, Dan, I'm remembering one of our first articles was written with Michigan Department of Ag, and it had some like of those basic questions that could be asked by an agency, you know, in an audit. And like with the companies, when you start to ask questions and say, or I say, Donna, I'm gonna come visit your beef farm in next month. Here's 10 questions I'm gonna ask. Donna's gonna work on. And same with the that's the USDA training has 20 questions. We have 10 basic questions for food fraud and then 10 more for organics. And they lay out these are well, partially they lay out the 20 questions so that the auditors know how to fully do an audit. Because they're food safety auditors, they're organic, they're not crime auditors. Right. So here's these 20 questions to start. That also gives the person that's getting audited, so Donna knows the questions. Now she can ask, oh, wait a second, question number 17, how much information do you want about this, or how much detail? That's perfect. Because again, we're not trying to go penalize Donna. The goal is that Donna knows what the requirements are and she's fully implementing it. So it makes the audit easier. We're not trying to get away with anything. We're just trying to get everybody on the same page. And even the criminals, once if they know these 20 questions are there, they're going to adapt, and they're going to know that their life is harder, and they're going to have better products. All of a sudden, it's going to move out. If we know there's going to be some public health testing or species testing, then they're not going to sell the Dartmouth. They're not going to use the Dartmouth beef and the Cornell beef. They're just going to do their own thing, or they're going to, well, they might steal some Cornell beef cows to sell in the system. But look, we've already changed. That's changed the dynamics. That's made Donna's life harder. And right. And Sam, you said that a bit. About the thing is we're trying to make crime, or maybe Dan did, we reduce crime by increasing the risk of getting caught or the cost of conducting the crime. And if now Donna, to commit that Cornell beef fraud, has to go steal some Cornell cows, that's a whole different story than her taking her Dartmouth cows and just putting them on a truck.
Right. Well, that's that's the cat and mouse game, right? The always evolving. Huh.
That's it.
Yeah.
We say whack-a-mole, but that's it because they keep popping up. It's similar. You're right. A similar thing.
Don, that's not more of a criminal. Yeah. How often are you seeing companies, request vulnerability assessments? I mean, is that an active thing, or, again, it's always a thing of time and resources for everybody, but.
Yeah. Well, the key is it's in a food safety audit. Mm-hmm. There's a set of questions that you have to go through. And the auditor's asking questions like, tell me about your process. And then companies will very frequently ask their suppliers to demonstrate, convince them that they actually do have a vulnerability assessment in place and their prevention strategy meets the needs. Now that gets to be a lot of confidentiality, and there's some commercially sensitive information there, but still, if I'm buying product from you and you say you're GFSI compliant, you've told somebody, an auditor, you've convinced an auditor that you're meeting these processes. And then you need to convince me as well if I'm going to keep paying the premium. We actually have another bit. I'm now in the supply chain management department, and we have a work that we're finishing on what can we expect of our suppliers to provide for documentation for food fraud prevention, because that then clarifies to Donna what she really needs to do to convince you, or that you, again, the USDA is what do you have to do to convince a USDA inspector. At the same time, we're saying USDA inspector, here's what Donna needs to show you before you check the box.
Interesting. Yeah, cool.
It's evolving.
It's evolving. Yeah.
It can be so simple when we go through the whole process of the full evaluation, the full, think about a full physical for you. You go to Mayo Clinic, Cleveland Clinic, whatever, and you get a top down. Then you brought everything that possibly could be wrong with a human, and you get down to, you should take some more vitamin D and don't eat so many French fries, or at the same time maybe it's skin cancer. Do not go in the sun. You look at the whole system. That's a complex process, and it's multidisciplinary. It's right. Criminology, it's forensic accounting, it's supply chain, it's food science, it's food authenticity, it's all those sciences. But then you can get down to a pretty simple vulnerability, and at that point, when you know the vulnerability, like that, whatever health problems each of us has is different, then each of us will have a tailored plan, and that tailored plan does not have to be expensive or intense in many cases.
That's right. putting it out there, having your plan, putting it out there, and then trying to mitigate.
And
Yeah.
talk about it. See, that's the thing from like Interpol with like the Nordic countries or Denmark itself. Once they have their own plan, they talk about it and talk to each other. Hey, what do you think? What do you see? And all of a sudden, Dan says, hey, you know what? We're seeing all this other stuff in one area. And Donna says, hey, I'm worried about these Dartmouth cows. Now we have a network, and they do the vulnerability assessments at least once a year, and that's required in the food safety management systems to review your entire company once a year. And you might not spend, it might just be 8 of us on the call talking about it, but still we're thinking about it. And hopefully what happens is that we're always talking about this. We might have just seen in the news the horse meat or the next horse meat, or maybe there's snake meat in something. Well, all of a sudden then we then talk, hey, in New York, do we need to worry about the snake meat getting in the specialty product? And if we're doing that, then at least once a year, we're doing that horizon scan of everything out there. And then we can judge ourselves as a group, okay, is this a problem or not? Now, Dan is thinking from an agency standpoint, is this a public health threat? Which products? Is it also an economic? Maybe it offsets New York sturgeon eggs or something, something super, super valuable. All of a sudden, then, whoa, ding, 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 ding. Dan's looking at it now. This might be long before it happened. A great example is Ukraine, Russia. So 7 days after Russia went into Ukraine, I did a lecture for my introduction to supply chain class about what could happen.
Right.
Companies called later that day, and we did an analysis to say, what's the food fraud potential? Because the vulnerability does change. We don't know how much and how fast. But at that point, 7 days in, we didn't know. I mean, Russia might have left at day 8.
Right.
Or what we're seeing now is a third of the agriculture region in Ukraine could be a hazardous waste site that never will be possible for human food. I mean, if there's just people living in the fields, you've got, it's not ready to be tilled. So those are a wide range of activities. And so what we did is then look at what type of fraud could occur and what could we do right now? Let's say sunflower oil. So companies, while we were on the first call at day 8, they're telling their group to go ahead and increase their testing of the weights, so they're not short weighted for volume.
Yep.
That could happen this afternoon. The other is there's already authenticity tests or contamination tests they use. Hey, just increase the ones for sunflower oil. Again, it's not doing it for every product you buy, but all of a sudden there were things that at day 7 we knew that fraud could be coming later.
Sure.
And one thing people says, "Bob, but John, there's not much food fraud related to Ukraine, Russia."
Yeah, but yeah, you want to
maybe we identified it.
Yeah, cool. And then did that like, so the testing that you did on the honey and the meats and all that, was that driven by then, right, vulnerability assessment that said, hey, maybe we should do a quick survey and see what's going on, or was that kind of an internal thing and you decided to do it?
Well, for something like that, we allow our professional investigators and inspectors to look at what's on the shelf and make a determination whether or not that really needs to be tested, right? But when you're talking vulnerability assessment, do you remember the Wanabana cinnamon, right?
Oh,
yep.
Right. Yep.
Right. It's my understanding that lead chromate is a really, really good industrial coloring, and it's similar in color to cinnamon, right? And it's my understanding that there's a thought that the cinnamon used in that product may have been contaminated with lead chromate, right? I'm not the lab person. I'm not the one saying, but one of the things that came down through the FDA is let's spend more time looking at cinnamon. And they asked many states to grab products of many different kinds. And they gave us very specific, things to look for. And we took samples on that. And we were surprised at some of the results that we had, right? One example is we were asked to pull cinnamon flavored tea, right? Well, me and pulling my math out, how much cinnamon is in a tea bag, how much tea is going to be steeped out into the cup that you're going to drink, right? Lo and behold, we had a really, really high result on one of those tests. It was amazing, right? I think, based on that, generally speaking, as regulators, we're considering cinnamon, a risk, right? Some of that lead risk is based on growing areas. It was not intentional, right? But you don't know, right? And the health impact is what we're focusing on. Even if you get that cinnamon from a certain area, right? It may be unintentional, but it's there, right? What do companies do to avoid that risk, right? Well, it was either intentional from a safe location in the world where it can grow, or unintentional from an unsafe area, right? I've learned from some companies when they talked about where they source the materials from is they're going to those sources and they're testing the soil. Said, my product that I'm buying is going to come from this field. Can I test the field? Right. And I got some, really interesting information from those companies. Said, yes, when you're talking about contamination of soil, right? You're talking runoff, you're talking depressions in certain fields where the runoff, concentrates, right? They were that specific and said, I want my potatoes from anywhere except that dip. There is a whole host of things to consider. All right. Our food lab, bar none, is an expert in their fields. I am in awe with them. Right. We give them so much work to do, but that's thousands of samples of all the food that comes into New York. To say it's a drop in the bucket is an insult to the drop. All right. So we're not necessarily seeing a result that says, oh my goodness, here is a risk for this category of food, right? We have a risk for a specific lot of a specific product, and we get that off the shelf, and then we move on, right? I'm not in love with that, but that's where we're at.
No, that's great. No, it's a great perspective of, what's going on the ground, and then all the things to think about, right, from a vulnerability perspective and controlling food thoughts. So I want to thank Dan and John for coming on and talking with us. It was great. I learned a lot. I hope everybody else calling in learned a lot, and I've got a lot to think about now and chew on afterwards. So hopefully we all get to talk again soon. So thank you, Dan, John, everyone. Thank you, Donna, for mixing in a little bit of Dartmouth cows in there, but let's keep Cornell going, and we'll see everybody for the next office hours. Take care.